On a frozen mountain where most people would never dare to stay, a lone cowboy made a choice that quietly changed his fate. One winter night, deep in the Colorado high country, he heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A fragile cry, barely alive, calling from the darkness. Helping meant breaking nature's rules. Ignoring it meant living with the silence forever. He stepped outside anyway, and what answered him from the mountain was something no one would believe. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Durango, Colorado sat under a sky that looked scrubbed thin by cold. In late November, the town wore winter the way an old rancher wore a battered coat, without complaint, but with a wary understanding of what it could cost. The mountains shouldering the horizon were already white along their crowns, and the Animas River ran dark and fast, its edges crusting with ice each night, as if the water were trying to harden into stillness. Wind moved through the pines above town with a steady, low moan. It wasn't dramatic weather, no blizzard yet, no headline storm, but it was the kind that worked on a person quietly day after day, draining heat from the bones and patience from the mind. People in Durango took their gloves seriously, their tires seriously, and their goodbyes seriously too, because winter in the San Juans had a habit of turning "I'll be back before dark" into a lie. Beyond the last cluster of homes, where the county road narrowed into a rutted track and the light from town thinned into nothing, a small cabin leaned into the edge of the forest like it was trying to borrow strength from the trees. It had been built by hands that understood storms. Thick timbers, a roof pitched steep enough to shed snow, windows small enough to keep warmth from leaking out too fast. Smoke rose from the chimney most mornings, a narrow gray ribbon that told anyone looking that something alive still occupied that patch of wilderness. In late fall, when other cabins sat boarded up and silent, this one stayed awake. Inside, a man in his early 30s stood at the sink, rinsing coffee grounds from a tin filter with water so cold it stung. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned not to waste energy. His shoulders were broad, his frame lean but powerful, the kind shaped by work that never quite ended. He wore denim and a flannel shirt under a heavy canvas jacket, the jacket stained at the cuffs and shoulders from years of loading hay, lifting fence posts, dragging chains. His face looked carved by wind, high cheekbones, a straight nose that had been broken once and set crooked, a short beard the color of dark wheat, kept trimmed not for style but because it itched when it grew too long. His eyes were light, a pale gray blue, and they held a steady watchfulness, as if part of him expected the world to test him at any moment. His name was Caleb Mercer. He was 33, and he had become the kind of man who did not speak unless the words were necessary. In town, people described him in simple ways: quiet, reliable, a good hand, a little hard to know. No one said lonely outright, but they implied it when they mentioned how he never stayed long at the diner, how he always paid cash and left a clean table behind, how he listened more than he talked. There had been a time, years ago, when he had smiled easily, when laughter came out of him without effort. That time ended the winter his father died in a mining accident west of Silverton, crushed by a collapse that men later blamed on bad timbering and worse luck. Caleb had been 17 then. His mother had already been gone, taken by pneumonia when he was 10. After that, he learned quickly what grief demanded. Keep moving, keep working. Don't let the absence swallow you whole. The cabin did not belong to him by deed, not officially. It belonged to an older ranching family, the Delaney's, who had run cattle in these hills for generations until debt and age and changing weather finally pushed them downhill. Caleb worked for them as a ranch hand in the summers, mending fence, riding line, helping with calves, until the year they decided to sell most of the herd and close up the upper pasture for good. Mr. Delaney, a square-shouldered man with sun-creased skin and a voice like dry gravel, had taken Caleb aside one evening and asked a question that sounded casual, but wasn't. "You want to stay up there through winter?" he'd asked, as if discussing a hobby. Caleb had looked at the high pasture, at the cabin, at the dark line of timber beyond. "I can," he'd said. if you need someone to keep an eye on things. Mr. Delaney's eyes had narrowed. He was in his late 60s, with a thick mustache gone white and hands permanently stained by grease and dirt. He could read men the way other people read books. "I didn't ask if you could," he'd said. "I asked if you want to." Caleb hadn't answered right away because the truth was too plain. He didn't have much waiting for him in town. He had no wife, no kids, no family dinners. He had a rented room above a mechanic shop that smelled like oil, and he had a mind that got loud when the nights were too quiet. Up here, the wind in the trees filled the silence with something honest. He had finally said, "Yeah, I want to." So the arrangement was made. Caleb would stay in the cabin through the winter months, check the fences after storms, keep the roof clear, make sure squatters didn't decide the place looked abandoned. In exchange, he could live there rent-free, chop firewood from deadfall, and use the old barn tools. It wasn't a romantic arrangement. It was practical. But to Caleb, it felt like more than that. It felt like a place where the world made sense again. Work equaled warmth, attention equaled safety, effort equaled survival. His horse, Boone, stood in the lean-to shed beside the cabin, shifting in the straw. Boone was an older gelding, chestnut with a wide white blaze and a scar along his left shoulder where barbed wire had once caught him. He was steady in the way older horses often were, less flash, more trust. When Caleb stepped outside with a bucket of grain, Boone pricked his ears and blew softly, fog rolling from his nostrils. Caleb ran a hand down the horse's neck, feeling the thick winter coat beneath his palm. "Morning," he murmured, as if the horse needed the greeting to start the day. A dog emerged from under the porch a moment later, stretching long and slow. It was a German shepherd mix with a heavy gray-black coat and amber eyes that seemed permanently alert. The dog's name was Rook, a name Caleb had chosen because it fit the animal's personality. Watchful, intelligent, always scanning the tree line. Rook was not a young dog anymore. The fur around his muzzle had begun to silver, and his joints stiffened on cold mornings. But his loyalty was fierce, and his hearing was sharp enough that he often noticed things before Caleb did. He trotted alongside Caleb as they walked toward the woodpile, tail level, ears forward. That morning, Caleb's tasks were simple: split more kindling, check the generator, make sure the propane tank was still half full. He worked with methodical calm, the axe rising and falling, the sound of it echoing once and then being swallowed by the trees. Each log split cleanly, the grain cracking like bones. He stacked the wood neatly under the eaves, building a wall of fuel against the coming months. In winter, the cabin stove ate constantly. Firewood wasn't just heat, it was time bought back from the cold. Later, he saddled Boone and rode the fence line. The upper pastures spread out like a rough green-brown quilt, stitched by snowdrifts and shaded hollows. The fence posts leaned at angles that had worsened with age, and Caleb made mental notes of which ones would need bracing before spring. He stopped at the far corner where the land dropped into a gulch and listened. Rook stood beside Boone's legs, nose lifted, sniffing the air. The woods were quiet, but not empty. Caleb could feel it the way he always could, the subtle sense that the wilderness held its own traffic, its own logic, its own inhabitants moving just out of sight. On the way back, he spotted fresh tracks near the creek. Not deer, not elk, something lighter, smaller, but with a purposeful gait. He dismounted, crouched, and brushed snow aside with his glove. The print was narrow, with sharp toe marks and a faint drag line behind it, where something had brushed the surface. Caleb frowned, studying it. Rook sniffed once and gave a low woof, not a bark, but a warning sound. "Bobcat," Caleb muttered, more to himself than the dog. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how close it had come to the cabin area in daylight. Caleb stood slowly, scanning the trees. He didn't see anything, but he felt watched, the way a person feels when someone stands just beyond a doorway listening. He mounted Boone again and rode on, but the sensation stayed with him like a small stone in a boot. Back at the cabin, the afternoon light already looked weak, the sun sliding toward the ridgeline as if it were reluctant to stay. Caleb fed Boone, refilled water, and set a pan of stew on the stove. The cabin smelled like onions and smoke and damp wool. Rook lay near the hearth. Oh, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched at every outside sound. Caleb ate in silence, then sat with a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the trees. The world beyond the glass looked calm, but Caleb knew calm was not the same as safe. Calm was often the pause before weather made up its mind. He thought about town, the way people hurried between warmed buildings, the way they talked about winter like an inconvenience. Up here, winter was a force with rules. If you respected those rules, you lived. If you didn't, you paid. Caleb had learned that early. His father had learned it too late. As night fell, he latched the door, checked the lantern, and banked the stove. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped, wood contracting with cold. Rook lifted his head and stared toward the back wall, listening. Caleb followed the dog's gaze, but heard nothing at first. Then, faint, distant, there was a sound from outside. Not a howl, not a bark. A soft cry, thin and sharp, carried on the wind like a warning. Caleb held still, cup halfway to his mouth. Rook rose without a sound, posture tense. The cry came again, closer this time, and Caleb's instincts, older than thought, clicked into place. He set the cup down, stood, and reached for his jacket. Whatever was out there, the mountain had decided to speak. The sound came again, sharper this time, cutting cleanly through the night like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Caleb Mercer stood by the table, the cabin's single lantern casting a warm circle around him, while the rest of the room fell away into shadow. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a restless hiss, lifting loose snow and dropping it again, as if the mountain were breathing in its sleep. Rook was already at the door, body rigid, ears pricked forward, a low, warning rumble vibrating in his chest, not a bark, not fear, but alert attention. Caleb pulled on his jacket, shrugging into the familiar weight of canvas and wool, and reached for the flashlight hanging by the door. He paused for half a second, listening, letting instinct sift through sound the way his father had taught him years ago. The cry came once more, weaker now, and closer. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a fox. It was thin, strained, almost breaking under its own effort. "That's not right," Caleb murmured, not to Rook, but to the quiet itself. He unlatched the door and stepped out onto the porch. Cold struck his face immediately, sharp and clean, filling his lungs with a bite that made his eyes water. The moon was half hidden behind thin cloud, enough light to paint the snow in dull silver. Rook slipped past him, paws soundless on the boards, nose already low, tracking. The cry came from the far side of the porch, near the old wire fence that marked the edge of the clearing. Caleb moved slowly, boots crunching softly, flashlight angled down. The beam caught on something small and hunched near the fence line, a shape barely darker than the snow around it. At first glance, it looked like a pile of leaves blown together by the wind. Then it shifted just slightly, and the sound came again, a fragile, desperate rasp. Caleb crouched, heart beginning to thud harder in his chest. There, tangled in a sagging strand of rusted wire, was a fawn, a mule deer fawn he realized, no more than a few months old. Its legs thin as broom handles, its coat dull and matted with ice. One hind leg was twisted awkwardly, caught where the fence had collapsed inward years ago. The animal's sides fluttered with shallow breaths, each one fogging the air faintly. Rook stopped a few feet away, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the small creature. He didn't advance. He didn't growl. He waited, looking to Caleb for direction. "Easy," Caleb whispered, though he wasn't sure who the word was for. He had seen death in the woods before. Harsh winters took the young and the weak without ceremony. Predators did their work quickly. The land, for all its beauty, did not hesitate. Caleb had learned that early, too. Interfering with wildlife wasn't just discouraged. It was often a mistake. Animals raised by humans didn't survive long. Animals saved sometimes died slower deaths later on. He knew all of this. The knowledge sat heavy in his mind, orderly and logical. But the fawn's eyes rolled weakly toward him, dark and glassy, and its chest hitched in a way that told him time was already running out. Caleb stood there longer than he meant to, breath fogging, fingers stiffening inside his gloves. He thought of his father, of the night he'd come home late from the mine, face gray with dust and exhaustion, and had stopped to free a calf tangled in a fallen gate, even though it meant working in the cold another hour. "You don't step over suffering just because it's inconvenient," his father had said then, voice tired but certain. "You do what you can, and you live with the rest." Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "All right." He set the flashlight down so its beam lit the fence and pulled a pair of wire cutters from his jacket pocket. He'd carried them for years out of habit. Kneeling in the snow, he worked carefully, cutting the rusted strand a piece at a time, mindful of the fawn's leg. The psa-tupeta. Animal flinched weakly at the first snap of metal, then went still, too exhausted to fight. When the wire finally gave way, Caleb eased the leg free and slid his arm under the fawn's chest. It weighed almost nothing. The realization made his throat tighten unexpectedly. This was a life that hadn't yet had the chance to be heavy with experience, with muscle and memory. Just fragile warmth, fading fast. He didn't hesitate anymore. He lifted the fawn gently and carried it toward the porch. Rook followed close, glancing back toward the trees, then forward again, as if measuring distances, counting exits. Inside the cabin, the heat hit Caleb like a wave. He shut the door firmly and laid the fawn on an old wool blanket near the stove, careful not to bring it too close too fast. He remembered enough from his years working around livestock to know sudden heat could shock an animal already weakened by cold. He knelt beside it, rubbing its legs slowly through the blanket, encouraging blood to move again. The fawn made a faint sound, barely audible, and its eyes fluttered closed. Caleb worked without thinking about time. He changed blankets when they grew damp, adjusted the stove draft, fetched a shallow pan of water and set it nearby. Rook lay a few feet away, chin on his paws, eyes never leaving the small body on the floor. His ears flicked at every creak of the cabin, every distant sound outside. An hour passed, maybe two. The fawn's breathing steadied slightly, though it remained weak. At one point, its nose brushed Caleb's sleeve, and he froze, startled by the intimacy of the gesture. It wasn't trust exactly. It was instinct, drawn toward warmth. Caleb leaned back on his heels, exhaustion creeping into his limbs now that the immediate urgency had eased. That was when the second thought arrived, cold and unwelcome. Where was the doe? Deer did not abandon their young without reason. Predators, storms, injury, something had driven the mother away or kept her from returning. Caleb moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. Snow fell steadily now, fine and dry, whispering as it struck the glass. The tree line stood black and dense beyond the clearing, offering 1,000 places to hide. Rook rose and joined him, hackles lifting just slightly. "You smell it too?" Caleb murmured. He didn't need an answer. Sometime after midnight, when the cabin had settled into the slow rhythmic ticking of wood cooling and the wind had dropped to a steady sigh, Caleb heard it. Not a cry this time, not movement in the brush, just a presence, heavy and unmistakable, pressing against the edge of the clearing like a held breath. He killed the lantern and moved to the window again, relying on moonlight now. At first, he saw nothing. Then the shape resolved itself near the far trees, low, muscular, still as stone. A mountain lion. A female, he guessed, by her size and build. Her coat blended almost perfectly with the shadowed snow. Tawny fur dusted white along her back. Her tail lay low, barely twitching. Her eyes caught the moonlight and burned pale gold. Caleb did not reach for his rifle. It leaned in the corner, loaded and ready as it always was, but something in the cat's posture stopped him. She was not stalking. She was not crouched to spring. She was waiting. His heart hammered loud in his ears, but he forced himself to remain still. The cat's gaze shifted briefly toward the cabin, then toward the woods behind her, then back again. Calculating, assessing. The fawn stirred faintly behind Caleb, a soft sound that barely registered. The mountain lion's head lifted. Caleb swallowed. He understood then, with a clarity that made his hands tremble slightly, exactly what line he had crossed. By freeing the fawn, by bringing it into his home, he had stepped into a story older than fences and cabins and men, predator and prey, mother and offspring, hunger and survival. He stood there for a long moment, neither man nor animal willing to make the first move. Snow gathered on the porch rail. The cold seeped through the glass. Finally, the lion turned away, melting back into the trees without a sound. Caleb exhaled shakily, only then realizing how tightly he'd been holding his breath. He leaned his forehead briefly against the cold glass, eyes closed. "Damn it," he whispered, not in anger, but in awe. He went back to the fawn and knelt beside it, watching its chest rise and fall. Outside, the mountain had taken notice. Whatever happened next would not be simple. He knew that as surely as he knew the weather. By the time dawn began to gray the edges of the sky, Caleb had not slept. He sat in his chair, coffee gone cold in his hands, eyes fixed on the small life warming by the stove. The choice had already been made. He didn't know yet what it would cost him, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. That fawn should not have been there. And now, neither should he. Morning arrived without warmth. The light that crept through the cabin windows was thin and colorless, the kind that made every shadow look permanent. Caleb Mercer stood at the stove, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness that had settled into them after a sleepless night. Coffee steamed in his cup, untouched. He had learned long ago that exhaustion didn't announce itself loudly. It simply slowed your thinking, dulled the edges of judgment. Out here, that could be dangerous. On the blanket near the stove, the fawn lay curled in on itself, legs tucked awkwardly, chest rising and falling in shallow but steady rhythm. Its coat had dried overnight, revealing the soft brown hide speckled faintly with white. One ear twitched now and then, responding to the crackle of fire or the shift of air when Caleb moved. It was alive. That fact alone carried weight. Rook lay a few feet away, head on his paws, amber eyes open and watchful. He hadn't slept much either. The dog was 8 years old, past the age of reckless curiosity, but his instincts remained sharp. His gray-black coat was thick, especially along the shoulders and back, and it gave him a solid, grounded look, like an animal meant to stand between danger and whatever mattered most. Every so often, his ears angled toward the back wall of the cabin, as if listening to something Caleb couldn't quite hear. Outside, the forest looked unchanged, but Caleb knew better. Snow had fallen lightly through the night, smoothing the ground, erasing the marks of yesterday. Any tracks left by the mountain lion would be gone now, replaced by a blankness that hid more than it revealed. He stepped to the window and scanned the tree line, eyes moving slowly, deliberately. Nothing moved. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, subtle but persistent, resulting not from fear but from awareness. Caleb set his cup down and crouched near the fawn. He checked the injured leg carefully, fingers gentle but practiced. The swelling hadn't worsened, which he took as a small victory. He tore a strip from an old cotton shirt and fashioned a loose sling, enough to support without cutting off circulation. He didn't fool himself into thinking he was fixing anything. He was buying time. That was all. "You hear that?" he murmured softly, though the cabin was quiet. He wasn't speaking to the fawn so much as acknowledging the silence itself. Around mid-morning, Boone whickered softly from the shed, reminding Caleb that life did not pause simply because things had become complicated. Caleb pulled on his coat and stepped outside to tend to the horse. Boone stood patiently, head low, breath fogging the cold air. He was a big animal, heavy through the chest, his movements slower than they had been years ago, but still sure. His dark eyes followed Caleb calmly as grain hit the bucket. "You picked a hell of a winter to get interesting," Caleb said quietly, running a hand along Boone's neck. The horse flicked an ear, unconcerned. As Caleb straightened, he noticed something on the far edge of the clearing, a disturbance in the snow that hadn't been there the day before. Not tracks exactly, more like a place where the snow lay thinner, brushed aside. He squinted, heart ticking a little faster. It wasn't close. It wasn't threatening, but it was deliberate. Back inside, Rook lifted his head as soon as Caleb entered, reading the tension in his posture. "She's still around," Caleb said, low. Rook's tail thumped once against the floor, not in excitement, but acknowledgement. By early afternoon, the weather shifted. Clouds thickened, lowering the sky, and the air took on a brittle edge that suggested more snow was coming. Caleb knew better than to ignore those signs. He checked the generator, secured loose items on the porch, and stacked more wood near the door. Practical tasks steadied him, gave his hands something to do while his mind wrestled with the larger problem. Because the problem was no longer the fawn alone. The problem was balance. He had grown up understanding that mercy had consequences, sometimes good ones, sometimes not. Out here, every act rippled outward, touching lives you might never see. Saving the fawn meant drawing attention. It meant altering the quiet contract between predator and prey, between man and mountain. Caleb had no illusions of heroism. He had simply chosen not to step over suffering. Now he would have to live with the rest. Late in the afternoon, Rook stiffened suddenly, rising to his feet with a soft growl that stopped short of sound. Caleb followed his gaze to the window just as movement caught his eye. At the far edge of the clearing, where the forest thickened, a shape emerged. The mountain lion did not rush. She stepped into view with measured calm, her body long and powerful, muscles shifting beneath her tawny coat. Snow dusted her shoulders and clung to the fur along her spine. Her tail moved slowly. Behind her, not lashing, not tense, controlled. She was larger than Caleb had expected, her head broad, her ears scarred slightly at the tips, signs of years lived hard and survived. She stopped where the trees gave way to open ground and sat back on her haunches. Caleb felt the instinctive urge to reach for his rifle rise and then fade. He kept his hands visible at his sides and didn't move. Rook stood beside him, body rigid but silent, awaiting a command that did not come. The lion's gaze fixed on the cabin. Not on Caleb. Not on Rook, on the space beyond the walls, on the fawn. Caleb swallowed and stepped closer to the window, careful not to make sudden movements. He understood now what had unsettled him earlier. This was not an animal acting blindly on hunger. This was a mother calculating risk. "She knows," he said quietly. The lion rose and took a few steps forward, then stopped again. The distance between her and the porch remained constant, as if she were respecting a boundary neither of them had formally drawn. Snow began to fall again, thin flakes drifting down between them, softening the space. Caleb made a decision then, one that surprised him with its clarity. He reached into the freezer and took out a package of venison, meat he had saved carefully for the months ahead. He stepped outside slowly, Rook staying at his heel, and placed the package on a flat rock near the edge of the clearing. He didn't look directly at the lion while he did it. He didn't turn his back either. He simply set the offering down and stepped away. The mountain lion watched him without blinking. Back on the porch, Caleb stopped and waited, his breath fogged, his heart beat hard but steady. The lion didn't move at first. Then, after several long moments, she approached the meat, head low, every muscle ready. She sniffed it, then dragged it back toward the trees in one smooth motion and disappeared without a sound. Caleb sagged slightly, tension draining from his shoulders. He hadn't solved anything, but he had spoken in the only language that mattered here. The next 2 days passed in a strange rhythm. The fawn grew stronger, lifting its head, attempting to stand before collapsing again. Caleb adjusted the sling, cleaned the leg, and kept the animal warm. He left food at the edge of the clearing each evening, not always meat, sometimes just bones, sometimes scraps. The mountain lion returned after dark, never coming closer than the tree line, never showing aggression. Rook would watch from the window, silent and still. It was not peace. It was an understanding. On the third morning, Caleb noticed something new. The fawn was standing on 3 legs, trembling but upright. When it saw Caleb, it did not bolt. It did not panic. It simply watched him, dark eyes alert and alive. That, more than anything else, tightened his chest. "You don't belong here," he said softly. "You never did." By afternoon, the storm arrived in earnest. Snow fell hard, wind driving it sideways, swallowing the world beyond the cabin in white. Visibility dropped to nothing. Caleb kept the fire fed and stayed inside, Rook close, the fawn resting quietly. The mountain felt sealed, isolated from the rest of the world. That night, long after darkness had settled, Caleb heard movement on the porch. Slow, careful, not claws scraping, not weight shifting nervously. He stood, heart steady now in a way it hadn't been before. At the door, he paused. Whatever came next would decide whether mercy had been foolish or necessary. The knock came again, softer than before, barely more than a suggestion against the wood. Caleb Mercer stood on the far side of the door, his hand resting flat against the grain as if he could feel what waited beyond it through the timber alone. The storm pressed hard against the cabin now. Wind shoved at the walls, snow hissed across the porch boards, and the world beyond the door had narrowed to cold and motion. Inside, the stove burned steady, its heat radiating through the small space in a way that felt almost defiant. Rook stood a few steps behind Caleb, body angled forward, weight balanced evenly on all 4 paws. His gray-black coat bristled slightly along the spine, not in aggression but readiness. At 8 years old, Rook had learned restraint the hard way, through scars, through nights guarding cattle from coyotes, through winters that had thinned his muzzle and sharpened his instincts. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He waited, eyes fixed on the door, trusting Caleb to decide. Caleb drew in a slow breath and opened the door no more than a foot. The mountain lion stood there, close enough now that he could see the individual whiskers frosted white, the subtle scar that split the fur above her left eye, the powerful slope of her shoulders as she leaned forward slightly into the wind. Snow clung to her coat in uneven patches, melting and refreezing as she shifted her weight. She was thinner than she should have been for this time of year, not starving, but hungry enough that every decision carried cost. They stared at each other across the narrow opening, neither moving. The lion's ears were forward, not flattened. Her tail lay still behind her, not twitching. She was not here to charge. She was here to assess. Caleb did not speak. Words meant nothing in this exchange. Behind him, the fawn stirred. A faint sound, barely a breath, but it was enough. The lion's head turned slightly, her gaze sliding past Caleb into the warmth beyond the door. Her nostrils flared. She knew exactly where her young was. Caleb felt the weight of the moment settle fully into his chest. This was the point of no return, the moment where hesitation would read as weakness and aggression would read as threat. He stepped back slowly and opened the door wider, then moved aside, leaving a clear path inside the cabin. Rook shifted, muscles tightening, but a quiet hand on his collar stilled him. The mountain lion hesitated only a second, then she stepped forward, movements fluid and controlled, paws making almost no sound on the wooden floor. She didn't look at Caleb as she passed him. Her attention was locked on the back room, on the faint warmth and scent that drew her like gravity. Caleb closed the door gently behind her, shutting out the storm, and stood very still. The lion reached the blanket near the stove and stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then she lowered her head and touched the fawn with her nose, a gesture so careful it barely disturbed the air. The fawn responded instantly, lifting its head and making a thin, high sound that cracked something open in Caleb's chest. The lion answered with a low, rumbling churr, wrapping her body partially around the smaller form, shielding it from drafts, from danger, from everything but her. Caleb watched from the doorway, every sense alert. He noted the way the lion positioned herself between the fawn and the rest of the cabin, the way her muscles remained coiled even as she settled. She was not relaxed. She was allowing this, nothing more. For several minutes, no one moved. Then the lion began to clean the fawn with slow, deliberate strokes of her tongue, removing dried blood and dirt, breathing warmth back into fragile skin. The fawn pressed closer, legs folding beneath it, eyes finally closing in something that looked like peace. Caleb exhaled. He backed away without turning his back, giving space. He poured water into a shallow bowl and placed it a few feet from the blanket, then retreated again. The lion watched him the entire time, golden eyes unblinking, but she didn't growl or bare her teeth. When Caleb stopped moving, she returned her attention to her young. The storm raged outside. Snow piled against the walls, wind screamed through the trees, and the cabin creaked as if testing its own resolve. Inside, time stretched and slowed. Caleb sat in his chair near the stove, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold, eyes never leaving the back room. Rook lay at his feet, body still tense, but no longer vibrating with warning. Hours passed like that. Sometime near dawn, the lion rose. She moved with quiet authority, nudging the fawn gently, encouraging it to stand. The fawn wobbled but remained upright, leaning into her mother's chest. The lion turned her head toward Caleb then, just once. Her gaze held no fear, no gratitude either, just recognition. Caleb nodded slightly, acknowledging what words could not say. She guided the fawn toward the door. Caleb opened it fully, cold air rushing in, snow swirling at their feet. The lion stepped outside first, then paused, waiting. The fawn followed, legs trembling but moving. When they reached the edge of the porch, the lion looked back again, briefly, then turned and disappeared into the white, her young stumbling after her until both shapes dissolved into the storm. Caleb stood in the open doorway long after they were gone, snow melting into his boots, the wind tugging at his jacket. The cabin felt suddenly larger, emptier. Rook whined softly and pressed against Caleb's leg. Yeah, Caleb murmured, finally closing the door. I know. The storm did not end that day. It intensified. For 2 days, snow fell without pause. The world beyond the cabin ceased to exist beyond a few yards. Caleb settled into a rhythm dictated by necessity, feeding the stove, checking the roof from inside, rationing food, sleeping in short stretches. Boone weathered the storm in the shed, insulated with extra straw and blankets. Caleb checked on him twice daily, brushing snow from his coat, speaking in low tones. The horse endured it with the patience of an animal that had known many winters. On the second night, Caleb noticed fresh tracks near the edge of the clearing, deeper now, more confident. Not just the lion, smaller prints too. Uneven, but purposeful. The fawn was moving on its own. He felt a strange mix of relief and loss. By the third morning, the storm began to weaken. Light returned in thin bands, and the wind lost its bite. Caleb stepped outside, surveying the damage. Fences were buried. The creek was invisible beneath drifts. But the cabin still stood, smoke rising as it always had. He found the venison he'd placed out the night before gone, the snow around it disturbed but not chaotic. The offering had been accepted. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, eyes closed, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He understood now that what had happened was not a miracle in the way people like to tell stories about miracles. There had been no magic, no bending of nature's laws. There had been respect. Inside, Rook settled back into his place by the stove, finally sleeping deeply. Boone stamped once in the shed, then went quiet again. The mountain had allowed Caleb to borrow a moment of trust, and in return he had given something back. As the sky cleared and blue crept tentatively into the world again, Caleb realized something had changed, not in the land, but in him. He was no longer simply staying here out of convenience or escape. He was now part of the mountain's memory, and memory, he knew, carried a price. The quiet after the storm felt unnatural, like a held breath that refused to release. Caleb Mercer noticed it the moment he stepped outside the cabin at first light. The snow lay deep and unbroken, smooth as linen stretched tight across the land, swallowing fence posts, rocks, and familiar landmarks alike. Sound didn't travel the way it should have. Even Boone's soft snort from the shed seemed muted, absorbed by the white expanse. The mountain looked calm, almost gentle, but Caleb knew better. He had lived long enough under open skies to understand that calm in winter was often just another kind of warning. He moved slowly, testing each step, letting his weight settle before committing. Rook padded ahead of him, nose low, ears swiveling, the dog's gray-black coat stark against the snow. Rook was restless this morning, his usual patience frayed by something Caleb couldn't yet name. 8 winters had sharpened the dog's instincts, and those instincts were whispering now. Easy, Caleb said under his breath, more for himself than the dog. He checked on Boone first. The horse stood solid and steady, though the snow had drifted nearly to his knees. Boone was a big animal, all chest and bone, his breath slow and measured, dark eyes calm despite the cold. Caleb brushed ice from his mane and checked his legs, fingers lingering longer than necessary. Boone leaned into the touch, a small gesture of trust that grounded Caleb in a way nothing else quite could. After tending the horse, Caleb turned his attention to the fence line. Storms like this one were notorious for collapsing old posts and burying wire in ways that turned invisible hazards deadly come spring. He strapped on his snowshoes, slung a coil of rope over his shoulder, and took his rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because experience had taught him never to assume safety. The world beyond the clearing was transformed. Trees bowed under the weight of snow, branches creaking softly, as they shed it in sudden whispering cascades. The creek was gone, erased beneath a frozen skin that disguised moving water as solid ground. Caleb moved carefully, eyes scanning for signs of instability, memory guiding him where sight failed. Rook stopped suddenly, hackles lifting just enough to be noticed. "What is it?" Caleb murmured. The dog wuffed softly and looked upslope, toward a narrow ridge that cut diagonally across the mountain's shoulder. Caleb followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing but shadow and snow. Then he noticed the subtle disturbance, a stretch where the snow lay thinner, broken, as if something heavy had passed through recently. Tracks. Not deer, not elk, and not the mountain lion either. These were human tracks, half filled with fresh snow, suggesting someone had been there before the storm had fully taken hold. Caleb frowned. No one had business up here in winter, not without reason. He hesitated only a moment before following. The climb was steeper than it looked. Snow hid ice beneath it, treacherous and unforgiving. Caleb leaned into the slope, planting each step deliberately, using the rope to steady himself against exposed rock. His breath burned in his chest, the cold sharp enough to sting his lungs. Rook stayed close, choosing his footing with careful precision. Halfway up the ridge, the mountain reminded Caleb who was in control. His left snowshoe slipped on a sheet of ice concealed beneath powder. His weight shifted too fast, momentum pulling him forward. He dropped to one knee, hands scrambling for purchase. For a split second, he thought he had it, thought the rope would hold, thought his boot would catch. Then the ice gave way entirely. Caleb slid hard, the world tilting violently as gravity took command. He slammed into rock, pain exploding through his shoulder, then his hip. His rifle struck stone and skittered away. He tumbled again, breath knocked from him in a sharp, helpless gasp before coming to a sudden stop against a fallen log half buried in snow. For a moment there was nothing but pain and silence. He tried to move. His right leg responded. His left did not. A white-hot bolt of agony shot up from his ankle the instant he shifted his weight. Caleb gritted his teeth, a low sound tearing out of his throat before he could stop it. He pressed a gloved hand against his mouth, forcing himself to breathe through the pain. "Damn it," he muttered, the word fogging the air. Rook appeared in front of him, eyes wide, tail low, a sharp whine breaking from his chest. The dog circled once, then pressed close, offering warmth, grounding Caleb in the present moment. "I'm all right," Caleb said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. He assessed the damage as best he could. His ankle was swelling rapidly, the joint already misshapen beneath layers of fabric, broken, or close enough to make little difference out here. He reached for his radio out of reflex, then remembered. No signal this far upslope. His phone was worse than useless, battery drained by cold. Caleb leaned back against the log, chest heaving. The sky was already shifting toward afternoon, the light thinning, shadows stretching long across the snow. He did quick calculations in his head, the way his father had taught him when things went wrong. Distance to the cabin, time before dark, temperature. None of the numbers came out in his favor. He tried to stand once, bracing himself against the log, only to collapse back with a strangled sound as his ankle buckled. Stars danced at the edge of his vision. He forced himself to stay still, to think. Panic crept in anyway, quiet and insistent. He was alone. No one knew he'd come this way. Even if someone did, the storm had erased tracks, buried paths. Night would come fast, and with it, cold that would settle deep into bone and blood. Caleb laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "So this is how the mountain collects," he murmured. He pulled his jacket tighter and focused on Rook, who refused to leave his side. The dog's presence was a thin line of sanity in a world that had suddenly narrowed to pain and cold. Caleb talked to him in a low voice, not because Rook needed reassurance, but because the sound of words kept the darkness at bay. Minutes stretched into something shapeless. The cold seeped in, numbing first his fingers, then his thoughts. The pain in his ankle dulled into a distant, throbbing ache, which worried him more than the sharp agony had. He knew that numbness was a liar. That was when he heard it. Not the wind, not the creak of trees. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, close. Caleb's heart lurched. He forced his eyes open wider, scanning the ridge above him. A shape emerged from the trees, fluid and silent despite the snow. The mountain lion. She stood a few yards away, her tawny coat blending perfectly with the shadows, her eyes catching the fading light and holding it. She was alone, no fawn in sight, but there was nothing empty about her presence. She looked at Caleb, not with hunger, not with fear, but with a strange, focused intent. Rook stiffened but did not bark. He glanced at Caleb, then back at the lion, as if awaiting instruction from both. Caleb didn't move. He barely breathed. The lion took a step closer, then another, stopping just beyond arm's reach. She circled him once, slow and careful, nose lifting to sample the air. Caleb could hear her breath, steady and controlled. He expected teeth, claws, the sudden violence he had always been warned about. It didn't come. Instead, she moved downslope a few paces, then stopped and looked back at him. Her tail flicked once. She returned, circled him again, pressing her paws into the snow, packing it down in a wide, unmistakable pattern. Caleb's mind struggled to keep up, fogged by cold and pain. "What are you doing?" he whispered. The lion repeated the pattern: circle, pause, retreat, each movement deliberate. Then she disappeared into the trees, only to return moments later and do it again, widening the disturbed area in the snow around Caleb's fallen body. Understanding struck him like a physical blow. She wasn't hunting. She was marking, creating something visible, something unnatural enough to draw attention, a signal in a world where humans had learned to read signs long before they built fences. Caleb's vision blurred, not from tears but from exhaustion. He let his head fall back against the log, a weak laugh escaping him. "You remember," he breathed. "You remember." The mountain lion completed one final circuit, then turned and vanished into the gathering dark, her form dissolving into shadow as if she had never been there at all. Caleb was alone again. But the panic had eased, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. Hope. He didn't know if it would be enough. He didn't know if anyone would come. But the mountain had not taken him yet. Sound returned before light. That was the first thing Caleb Mercer noticed as consciousness crept back in fragments, thin and uneven, like ice breaking on a river. At first, it was nothing more than vibration, a distant hum that threaded through the numbness in his limbs. Then it sharpened into something mechanical, rhythmic, out of place in the wilderness he knew so well. Voices followed, muffled but unmistakably human, carried strangely through the cold air. Caleb tried to open his eyes. One eyelid obeyed, the other felt glued shut. His mouth was dry, tongue thick, and every breath scraped through his chest as if his lungs had forgotten how to work properly. He focused on the sound, clinging to it the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. "There. Over here." The words were sharp, urgent, real. Flashlight beams cut across the snow, bright white arcs that made him squint. Shapes moved at the edge of his vision, orange and black against the pale ground. Boots crunched. Closer, fast and purposeful. "Hey!" a voice called, louder now. "Sir, can you hear me?" Caleb managed a sound that might have been a yes, or maybe it was just breath escaping. He wasn't sure. Two figures dropped to their knees beside him. One was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, bundled in high-visibility rescue gear, his beard dark and thick beneath a rim of frost. His face was weathered, lined by years of exposure, eyes sharp with practiced focus. The other was younger, late 20s perhaps, slimmer, with pale skin reddened raw by cold and a faint scar running from his left eyebrow down toward his cheekbone, half hidden beneath his hood. The older man pressed gloved fingers to Caleb's neck, checking his pulse. "He's alive," he said, relief threading his voice. "Barely, but alive." The younger rescuer swept a light over Caleb's body, pausing at his swollen ankle. "Looks bad," he muttered. "Hypothermia, too. We need to move him now." "Easy," the older man said, calm and steady. "One thing at a time." They worked with efficiency born of long experience. A thermal blanket wrapped around Caleb's shoulders. Heat packs pressed carefully against his core. Someone slid a foam pad beneath him, lifting with coordinated movements that sent flares of pain through his leg, sharp enough to cut through the fog for a moment. Caleb gasped, then groaned. "Sorry," he rasped automatically, the word an old habit, reflexive. The older rescuer gave a short, almost smile. "Don't apologize. You did the hard part, stayed alive." As they stabilized him, the younger man scanned the area, his light lingering on the churned snow around Caleb. Wide, deliberate circles, repeated patterns, too precise to be random. "That's what the hikers saw," he said, frowning. "Those tracks, they said it looked intentional." The older man followed his gaze, eyes narrowing. "Yeah," he said slowly. "It does." Caleb's head lolled to the side. His gaze drifted upslope toward the dark line of trees where shadow gathered thickest. For just a moment, no longer than the blink of an eye, he thought he saw movement there. A shape slipping between trunks, fluid and silent, tawny fur catching the last scrap of light before darkness swallowed it whole. She was gone. Caleb closed his eyes, a strange peace settling over him despite the pain. He had been found. The mountain had released him. The ride down was a blur of sound and motion. The rescuers secured him in a sled and moved with practiced urgency, navigating terrain that would have been impossible alone. Caleb drifted in and out, fragments of awareness rising and falling like waves. He caught glimpses of Rook running alongside, tireless and intent, refusing to leave. Someone noticed and laughed softly, breath fogging the air. "Guess he's part of the team," the younger rescuer said. "Wouldn't make it far without him," the shouted. Older one replied. They reached the trailhead just as full darkness settled in. An ambulance waited there, lights muted to avoid blinding the crew. Warm air rushed over Caleb as they lifted him inside, the scent of antiseptic sharp and unfamiliar after days of wood smoke and snow. His body shuddered as heat seeped back into him, painful and overwhelming. Before the doors closed, Caleb felt a familiar weight press briefly against his hand. Rook's nose, solid, real. "Take care of him," Caleb murmured, words slurring. "We will," someone promised. "You focus on getting through this." The hospital lights were too bright, the sounds too loud. Caleb faded again, surrendering to the pull of sleep that was no longer dangerous, but restorative. When he woke next, it was to the steady beep of a monitor and the muted murmur of voices beyond a curtain. A woman stood at his bedside, clipboard tucked against her chest. She was in her late 30s, hair pulled back into a tight knot, skin pale beneath fluorescent lights. Her expression was professional, but not unkind. "Caleb Mercer," she said. "I'm Dr. Elaine Porter. You gave us a scare." His throat worked. "Feels like I lost," he said hoarsely. She smiled faintly. "You didn't. Broken ankle. Severe exposure, a few bruises you'll be feeling for a while. But you're alive. That matters." "How long?" he asked. "Before you walk?" She tilted her head, considering. "Months. Before you're stubborn enough to try walking too soon, probably weeks." He huffed a breath that might have been laughter. Over the next days, the story filtered in piece by piece. 2 hikers, brothers from Pagosa Springs, bundled and cautious, had been snowshoeing the ridge after the storm, testing themselves against the backcountry they loved. They noticed the disturbed snow almost immediately. Not tracks moving through, but tracks circling, again and again, too large and deliberate to ignore. One of them had said it felt wrong to pass it by. They'd followed the pattern down slope and found Caleb barely conscious, Rook standing guard like a sentry. "You're lucky," the younger brother had said when he visited the hospital, a tall man with windburned cheeks and a nervous habit of rubbing his beard. "Another hour, maybe less, and—" He hadn't finished the sentence. Caleb didn't tell them everything. He said he'd fallen. He said the dog had stayed with him. He said the tracks must have been from animals moving through after the storm. That explanation satisfied most people. It was easier, safer. But sometimes, late at night when the ward quieted and the machines hummed softly, Caleb closed his eyes and remembered the way the mountain lion had moved, the intelligence in her gaze, the deliberate circles in the snow. She had understood something simple and ancient: find help, or make help find you. Weeks later, Caleb returned to the cabin on Crutch's ankle. Wrapped and aching, pride bruised but intact. The world looked different now, smaller somehow, as if he'd been away longer than he had. Snow still lay thick, but spring whispered at its edges, softening the cold. Rook met him at the door, tail wagging hard enough to sway his hips, eyes bright with relief. Boone stamped in the shed, nickering low. Everything that mattered had waited. Caleb stood on the porch for a long time, leaning heavily on one crutch, breathing in the sharp, clean air. He scanned the tree line instinctively, half expecting to see a tawny shape watching from the shadows. He didn't. But when he looked down at the snow near the edge of the clearing, he saw something else. Old tracks, nearly filled in now, wide and circular, etched faintly into the memory of the land. Caleb nodded once, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. "I remember," he said softly. The mountain had taken its turn. Now it was giving something back. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way truth often did, slowly, in pieces, softening what had once been rigid and unforgiving. When Caleb Mercer returned to the cabin for good, his ankle still stiff and aching beneath layers of wrapping, the snow had begun to retreat in uneven patches. The south-facing slopes showed bare earth again, dark and damp, while the shaded hollows clung stubbornly to winter. The air smelled different now, not warm yet, but alive. Pine sap, wet soil, the faint metallic tang of meltwater moving beneath ice. Caleb leaned heavily on his crutches as he stepped off the porch, testing the ground. His body felt unfamiliar to him, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Months of forced stillness had stripped away muscle he'd taken for granted, leaving behind a sharp awareness of every joint and tendon. Pain flared when he shifted his weight wrong, a reminder that survival had its cost. Rook stayed glued to his side, closer than he had ever been before. The German shepherd's gray-black coat was shedding now, tufts of fur catching on fence posts and low branches as he moved. At 8 years old, Rook carried himself with quiet confidence, but something in him had changed too. He watched Caleb constantly, amber eyes tracking every movement, every stumble, as if recalibrating his understanding of the man he guarded. "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb told him quietly, resting a hand on the dog's broad head. Rook's tail thumped once, solid and reassuring. Boone stood in the pasture, grazing carefully where the snow had pulled back enough to expose last year's grass. The horse had lost some weight over the winter, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, but his posture remained steady. He lifted his head when Caleb approached, ears flicking forward, and let out a low nicker that sounded like relief. Caleb smiled despite himself and reached up to scratch the familiar spot behind Boone's jaw. "Miss me?" he asked. Boone snorted softly, unimpressed by the question, but pleased by the attention. Life resumed in fragments. Caleb couldn't work the way he used to, not yet, but he adapted. He learned to move slower, to plan his steps, to rest without seeing it as failure. He mended what he could from a chair near the barn, sharpened tools, sorted supplies. The mountain did not care how quickly he healed, only that he respected its pace. Word of what had happened traveled faster than Caleb would have liked. It always did in small towns where winters were shared and survival stories carried weight. One afternoon, a pickup truck crunched its way up the rutted road toward the cabin, tires flinging mud. Caleb watched from the porch as it pulled to a stop. The man who climbed out was tall and broad, mid-50s, with a thick gray beard and a face permanently reddened by wind and sun. He wore a battered felt hat pulled low and a heavy jacket that had seen better decades. His name was Warren Pike, a neighbor from the lower valley, known for his blunt manner and his habit of saying exactly what he thought, whether it was welcome or not. He had once worked logging crews before a falling limb shattered his shoulder, forcing him into early retirement that hadn't softened him much. "Hell of a thing," Warren said by way of greeting, eyeing Caleb's crutches. "Heard you tried to wrestle the mountain and lost." Caleb snorted quietly. "Something like that." Warren's eyes drifted to the tree line, then back again. "People are saying some strange things," he added, "about tracks, circles, animals acting odd." Caleb said nothing, letting the silence stretch. Warren studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "The mountain's always been strange," he said finally. "Doesn't need our stories to make it so." He reached into the truck bed and hauled out a sack. "Brought you feed and some nails. Figured you could use both." Caleb accepted the offering with a nod. "Appreciated." Warren didn't linger. He never did. But before he left, he paused, one boot on the running board. "You're lucky," he said gruffly. "Most men don't get a second chance up here." Then he drove off, leaving dust and unasked questions in his wake. As the weeks passed, Caleb noticed changes he hadn't expected. The woods felt closer somehow, less like a backdrop and more like a presence. He found signs everywhere, scratches on bark, faint prints near the creek, tufts of tawny fur caught on low branches. The mountain lion did not show herself, not directly, but Caleb sensed her movements the way a sailor senses shifts in wind. One evening in late May, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold, Caleb sat on the porch with Rook at his feet. His ankle ached dully, a reminder that healing was not linear. He flexed it absently, eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. Movement caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just shadow. Then the shape resolved itself. A deer stepping cautiously into view, not a fawn anymore, nearly grown now, long-legged and alert, coat sleek with health. It paused at the tree line, ears swiveling, testing the air. Behind it, half hidden among the pines, stood the mountain lion. She was watching him. The moment stretched, suspended. Caleb did not rise. He did not wave. He simply sat, heart steady, breath slow. Rook lifted his head but remained still, sensing the gravity of the moment. The deer took a few steps forward, then stopped. The lion remained where she was, her presence less threatening than watchful. After several seconds, she turned away, melting back into the forest. The deer lingered a moment longer, then followed. Caleb released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Go on," he murmured. "You're all right now." Summer edged closer. The snow vanished from the lower slopes, and wildflowers pushed through where ice had ruled, months before. Caleb's strength returned gradually. He traded the crutches for a cane, then for nothing at all, though he still favored the ankle on bad days. Pain remained, but it had shifted from enemy to companion, a reminder, not a threat. He began riding Boone again, slow at first, staying close to the cabin. Each ride felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he'd thought lost. Rook ran alongside, tireless despite his age, joy evident in every stride. One afternoon, while checking the far fence line, Caleb came across something that stopped him cold. Near the same ridge where he'd fallen, the snowmelt had revealed packed earth beneath, a wide circular area where the ground was noticeably different, compacted more firmly than the surrounding soil. Grass struggled to grow there, bent and sparse. The marking. Caleb crouched carefully, running his fingers over the earth. Time and weather had softened it, but the shape remained, stubborn and clear. A message written in a language older than words. He sat back on his heels, a quiet understanding settling over him. That circle was not just a memory of danger. It was a reminder of connection, of debt repaid. That night, as stars bloomed overhead and the mountains settled into its summer rhythm, Caleb felt something shift inside him. He had come to the cabin to escape noise, to hide from grief, to endure. Somewhere along the way, endurance had turned into belonging. He was no longer just a man staying through winter. He was a man who had been answered. Summer reached the high country in full, unapologetic force. By July, the slopes above Durango were alive with color, purple lupine and yellow balsam root pushing through the grass, their petals catching sunlight that felt earned rather than given. The air was warm during the day, but still carried a cool edge at night, a reminder that the mountain never fully surrendered its authority. Caleb Mercer felt stronger now, not healed in the sense of being untouched, but settled like a bone that had knit crooked and learned how to bear weight again. He rose early most mornings, as he always had, but the urgency had softened. Pain lingered in his ankle when storms threatened, a dull ache that flared and receded, but it no longer frightened him. It grounded him. Rook followed him everywhere, gray-black coat gleaming in the sun, his muzzle now more silver than it had been in winter. At 9 years old, the dog moved a little slower, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, and his loyalty had deepened into something wordless and absolute. Boone thrived with the grass back. The old horse filled out again, muscle returning along his shoulders and hindquarters. He moved with the steady confidence of an animal who had endured and come through intact. Caleb rode him most afternoons, slow circuits at first, then longer stretches that traced the familiar boundaries of the land. Each ride felt like stitching himself back into the fabric of the place. One afternoon, while mending a fence near the lower creek, Caleb heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see a truck easing up the track, dust rising behind it. The driver stepped out and leaned against the door, surveying the valley with a practiced eye. The man was in his early 40s, tall and wiry, with sun-darkened skin and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a face permanently set in a thoughtful frown. He wore a ranger's hat pushed back on his head and a uniform faded by years of wear. His name was Lucas Hale, a wildlife officer assigned to the district, known for his calm demeanor and his refusal to sensationalize the land he worked to protect. He had grown up in Colorado, the son of a biologist who'd taught him early that nature didn't need heroes, just respect. "Mercer," Lucas called, offering a nod. "Heard you were back on your feet." "More or less," Caleb replied, leaning on the fence post. "What brings you up here?" Lucas glanced toward the tree line, then back. "We've been tracking a female mountain lion. Healthy, smart, keeps her distance, but she's been moving closer to human territory than usual." His eyes flicked briefly to Rook, then to Boone grazing nearby. "Figured I'd check in." Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest but kept his voice even. She hasn't caused trouble. No, Lucas agreed. Hasn't been aggressive. That's what's interesting. He hesitated, then added, there were reports last winter. Rescue. Team mentioned something odd. Tracks. Caleb said nothing. Lucas studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. I'm not here to press you. Just wanted you to know. We're monitoring, not hunting. Whatever balance exists up here, we're not looking to disrupt it. Caleb nodded, relief threading quietly through him. Appreciate that. Lucas tipped his hat and left as easily as he'd arrived, dust settling slowly in his wake. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the valley, Caleb sat on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Rook lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded. The world felt still in a way that wasn't tense, but complete. Movement drew Caleb's attention to the far edge of the clearing. The mountain lion stepped into view, her coat glowing softly in the amber light. She was broader now, stronger, the lean hunger of winter replaced by quiet confidence. Behind her, emerging from the homemade trees, came the deer, fully grown now, sleek and alert, its steps light and sure. They stopped together at the boundary where forest met open ground. Caleb didn't stand, he didn't reach for anything. He simply sat, heart steady, breath slow. Rook lifted his head but remained at rest, sensing no threat. The mountain lion held Caleb's gaze. In that moment, memory and presence overlapped. The cabin door in winter, the circle in the snow, the long wait on the ridge. Caleb felt no fear, only a deep, resonant understanding that settled into him like a final piece sliding into place. The deer took a few cautious steps forward, then paused. The lion remained where she was, watching. After a moment, the deer turned away and slipped back into the trees. The mountain lion lingered a second longer, her tail flicking once. Then she too vanished, absorbed by shadow and leaf and earth. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. That's it, he murmured. Go on. The night came on gently. Stars emerged one by one, sharp and bright against the dark. Caleb built a small fire outside the cabin, more for ritual than need, and sat beside it with Rook leaning against his leg. The flames crackled softly, sparks lifting and disappearing into the sky. He thought of his father, of the lessons that had seemed so simple when spoken and so heavy when lived. He thought of winter, of pain and cold, and the quiet intelligence that had answered his mercy with mercy of its own. He understood now that survival was not just about enduring. It was about listening, about recognizing when the world spoke back. Caleb remained in the high country long after summer faded. Autumn painted the aspens gold, then stripped them bare. Winter returned, as it always did, but it no longer felt like an adversary. He prepared carefully, stacking wood, checking lines, moving with patience rather than urgency. Years passed that way. Caleb grew older, his hair threaded with gray. Rook slowed, then one winter did not wake from his place by the stove, leaving behind a silence that cut deep but did not break him. Boone followed a few seasons later, laid to rest beneath a stand of pines overlooking the valley he had carried Caleb across for so long. Others came and went, rangers, neighbors, new hands on the lower ranches. Some stayed, some left. The mountain remained. One crisp autumn morning, a young journalist made the climb to the cabin, notebook in hand, eyes bright with curiosity. She asked about winter survival, about living alone, about why he stayed when others didn't. Caleb answered patiently, showing her the fences, the pasture, the places where snow piled deepest. Did you ever regret it? She asked finally. Caleb looked out over the valley, where mist clung to the low ground and sunlight broke through in gentle bands. He thought of the circle in the snow, of golden eyes in the dark, of being found. No, he said quietly, because when I needed an answer, the mountain gave me one. That evening after she left, Caleb sat on the porch once more. The air was cool, the sky clear. For a brief instant, at the edge of his vision, he thought he saw movement, a familiar shape watching from the trees. He smiled, small and certain. The mountain had answered back, and it always would. Sometimes God does not send miracles with thunder or light. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through a choice made in the cold, through compassion when no one is watching, through a moment where love feels risky but necessary. This story reminds us that when we show mercy, Even in small and unseen ways, God is already at work. What looks like coincidence may be His protection. What feels like loss may be preparation. And what seems forgotten is never truly abandoned in His eyes. In our everyday lives, we may never face a mountain storm or a frozen wilderness, but we all face moments where kindness costs us something: time, comfort, certainty. In those moments, choose compassion, choose faith, because God often answers us in the same quiet way we choose to answer others. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. If you believe that faith still matters, that quiet miracles still happen, and that no life is ever forgotten by God, please subscribe to this channel and walk with us through more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you, even in your coldest season, that you are never alone.